The story of the Appalachian Matriarch of Madness is one so unsettling it challenges reason itself, a grim saga that unfolded quietly in the shadow of America's mountains for nearly half a century. Hidden deep within the mist-draped hollows of eastern Kentucky, where fog clings to the hillsides like old, unspoken secrets, the Blackburn family lived for generations beyond the reach of society's gaze. This is the chilling chronicle of Eleanor Blackburn, a woman who, between 1923 and 1968, engineered one of the most disturbing legacies of familial unions ever recorded in the United States, producing a bloodline marked by devastating physical and mental decline. Our story truly begins in 1974, when authorities were summoned to a collapsing homestead buried deep in an unnamed hollow near the Kentucky-West Virginia border. What Sheriff Thomas Whitley uncovered that autumn afternoon would linger with him until his final days. The property could only be reached by a narrow dirt path that vanished into dense woodland. What awaited at its end was a family of 17, all connected by blood in ways that defied any normal understanding of kinship. When we got there, we could tell immediately something was off, Whitley recalled in his 1982 memoir. The quiet was the first thing. You'd expect kids running around, making noise, but there was only stillness. Then they began to appear, one after another, stepping from the house. That's when I knew we'd found something unnatural. The Blackburn compound, as investigators later called it, revealed a lineage deliberately shaped in isolation for more than 50 years. At its heart stood Eleanor Blackburn, born in 1902, who, by the time she reached her 70s, had fashioned what one social worker would later describe as a kingdom of her own design, with subjects born to serve her will. Eleanor Blackburn's beginnings appeared ordinary enough. Historical documents indicate she was born to coal miners who had settled in eastern Kentucky during the late 19th century. When both her parents succumbed to the influenza outbreak of 1918, 16-year-old Eleanor found herself the sole heir to the family's isolated property. In 1920, she married her first cousin, James Blackburn, a practice not unheard of in remote Appalachian communities of that era, though one that sat uneasily with broader social norms. Yet what distinguished the Blackburns from similar family unions was Eleanor's deliberate and obsessive intent to forge what she called the purest bloodline in America. Records preserved at the Pikeville County Courthouse show that between 1921 and 1935, Eleanor gave birth to 8 children. But those sterile documents only hint at what was truly taking shape. Beneath the surface, an ideology had begun to form, one rooted in her warped beliefs about purity and divine order. Former neighbor Mabel Hawkins, interviewed in 1975, remembered Eleanor's increasingly troubling declarations. She'd talk about how mixing bloodlines weakens families, how the outside world was ruining God's design. Then she stopped sending her kids to school, said they'd be tainted by lesser stock. We all thought she was just peculiar. Nobody imagined what was actually happening up there. By the early 1940s, Eleanor had severed nearly every tie with the surrounding community. Her eldest children reached adulthood without meaningful contact with anyone beyond the family's hollow. Then, gradually, they disappeared entirely from public sight. For almost 30 years, the Blackburns lingered only as whispers, a local legend glimpsed from afar but never confronted. It wasn't until the authorities unearthed the compound in 1974 that the true scale of what had unfolded came to light. Medical files and interviews with the few family members capable of coherent speech painted a horrifying picture. Eleanor had orchestrated marriages among her children and later, among their children, ensuring her bloodline folded back upon itself generation after generation. Dr. Harold Jenkins, who examined several Blackburn descendants in 1975, observed that the genetic fallout was precisely what medical science would predict. Recessive traits became dominant. Physical deformities multiplied. Each generation showed sharper cognitive decline. The third generation exhibited the most severe effects. Yet the true horror of the Blackburn saga wasn't merely the genetic decay, it was the cold calculation behind it. Eleanor's own journals, discovered among the ruins, revealed her systematic approach, a pseudoscientific crusade to purify her lineage, echoing long-discredited eugenic doctrines. For her, explained forensic psychologist Dr. Sarah Williams in a 1976 study, it was an experiment. She catalogued physical traits and abilities, pairing her descendants as though breeding livestock. Every detail was recorded with clinical precision. Her handwritten charts, noting height, eye color, posture, and temperament, exposed the method behind the madness. Eleanor Blackburn had become both scientist and subject in her own perverse pursuit of perfection. By the mid-1950s, Eleanor Blackburn's so-called experiment had entered its second generation. Her original 8 children had produced 23 offspring through various intrafamilial unions. Now in her 50s, Eleanor ruled over the compound with total, unquestioned authority, dictating everything from daily chores to meal portions, sleeping arrangements, and most disturbingly, who would be permitted to reproduce. Isolation became the cornerstone of her dominion. Over decades, the Blackburn property expanded into 5 crude dwellings encircling the original cabin, located nearly 12 miles from the nearest settlement. A weathered, hand-painted sign warned outsiders, * trespassers will be shot on sight. * few dared to find out whether it was merely a bluff. When investigators finally arrived in 1974, the physical decay of the homestead mirrored the family's deteriorated condition. Their homes had dirt floors, no running water, and only minimal electricity supplied by a sputtering generator. The furniture was handmade, rough, primitive, and scarce. The family survived on what they could grow in a small garden, the few animals they raised, and whatever they could hunt in the nearby woods. The environment was primitive, social worker Margaret Collins wrote in her report, but what alarmed us most was that they didn't seem to realize anything was wrong. They had no sense of how other people lived. Some of the younger Blackburns had never seen an automobile or even a photograph. Through later interviews, a grim picture of Eleanor's indoctrination emerged. She had cemented her power through a blend of religious fanaticism, corporal punishment, and psychological control. She positioned herself as both matriarch and prophet, a self-anointed spiritual authority who claimed divine purpose for her bloodline. She told us the world beyond the hollow was wicked, recalled Thomas Blackburn, one of her grandsons who showed higher cognitive function than most of his kin. She said we were chosen, that our blood had to stay pure. Anyone who disobeyed was punished. The medical findings from 1975 revealed how disastrously Eleanor's obsession had unfolded over generations. Her descendants suffered from skeletal deformities, weakened immune systems, cardiovascular defects, and profound intellectual disabilities. The third generation, her great-grandchildren, displayed the most severe symptoms, with some unable to walk, speak, or even feed themselves. Consanguineous unions dramatically increase the odds of recessive genes expressing themselves, explained geneticist Dr. Richard Thornton. What we observed in the Blackburn case was a textbook, though horrifying, example of that principle, magnified across multiple generations. Even more disturbing were Eleanor's final journals from the 1960s, which showed that she recognized her descendants' growing weakness, but saw it as part of her divine purification. The frailty seen in some lines, she wrote, is a cleansing. Only the strongest will remain, purified through suffering. Her control extended far beyond the genetic. She decided which children received rudimentary education, often using tattered primers from the 1920s, and which would be confined to labor or hidden entirely from view due to severe deformities. By the mid-1960s, the Blackburns had even developed their own dialect, an altered form of English with strange grammar and words foreign to outsiders. The family's social structure had evolved into a hierarchy, Eleanor at the top, her first-generation children below her, and the later generations assigned lower ranks. Sheriff Whitley later described the difficulty of communicating during the 1974 raid. They spoke English, but it wasn't quite English. They used words differently, had names for things we couldn't understand. The youngest ones barely grasped what we were asking. The question that haunted investigators was simple yet terrifying. How could such a reality persist unseen for so long? The answer lay partly in the geography, the hidden hollows of Appalachia, but also in institutional neglect. School records showed that as early as 1943, officials had noticed the Blackburn children's absence, yet wartime shortages prevented follow-up. In 1951, a health nurse raised concerns after a rare encounter with a family member, but her report was quietly filed away. The Blackburns slipped through every possible crack, concluded a 1976 congressional review. Their isolation was both geographic and bureaucratic, an entire world that the modern era simply never reached. As America marched through the civil rights movement, the space race, and cultural revolution, the Blackburn Hollow remained frozen in its own grim pocket of time, ruled by a woman whose mind had long since broken under the weight of her delusions. By the late 1960s, the Blackburn compound had expanded into a self-contained microcosm, roughly 30 surviving members living under one roof of decaying timber and mud-chinked walls. What little contact they maintained with the outside world came through rare trades with traveling peddlers or hunters who ventured too close to the hollow. Most accounts describe these encounters as deeply unsettling. Visitors often spoke of a silence that didn't feel right, a quiet so unnatural it made the air seem heavy. The Blackburn children, pale and hollow-eyed, would watch wordlessly from the shadows of the trees. Some witnesses claimed they made strange, animal-like noises, though investigators later suggested these were attempts at communication from individuals with severe speech impairments. Local legend soon took hold. Rumors spread of witch-blooded folk or mountain ghosts haunting the Blackburn property. Teenagers dared each other to approach the cabin, but few ever did. In truth, the Blackburns were not supernatural at all, just human lives twisted and broken by one woman's doctrine of purity. Eleanor herself, by then approaching 80, was almost mythic to those few who caught glimpses of her. She moved like something carved out of bone, one hunter recalled in a 1974 interview. White hair down to her waist, eyes sharp as glass. She didn't speak, just stared until you left. When law enforcement finally intervened in the spring of 1974, it wasn't because of a tip or missing persons report, it was pure coincidence. A brush fire had spread through the valley, prompting forestry officials to search the ridge line. That's when they discovered a labyrinth of shacks, rope-bound fences, and hand-dug wells, and realized people were living there. The first responders described the discovery as surreal. "It was like walking into another century," said Deputy Earl Monroe. "Everything smelled of rot and smoke. And then we saw them, figures watching from the trees, quiet and afraid." The raid unfolded over 2 days. Officers found several adults unable to state their own ages, children who couldn't speak coherently, and makeshift graves marked only by carved stones. The remains of at least 7 individuals were later exhumed and identified as Blackburn descendants. Inside Eleanor's cabin, investigators found her journals, genetic charts, and what appeared to be ritual symbols carved into the wooden walls. But there was no sign of Eleanor herself. Only an unmarked grave behind the house, shallow and hastily covered, suggested her end. DNA testing later confirmed it was indeed her remains. What the state uncovered stunned the nation. Forensic teams documented extreme deformities among the family members, cleft palates, fused fingers, skeletal asymmetry, and profound neurological deficits. Some adults had mental capacities equivalent to that of toddlers. Many were completely unaware of the world beyond their hollow. The surviving Blackburns were transported to medical facilities across Kentucky and Tennessee. Several could not adapt and later died in institutional care. A few younger members, after extensive rehabilitation, managed to integrate partially into society, though their psychological trauma was lifelong. Dr. Williams, who oversaw their psychological evaluations, later remarked, "They weren't monsters. They were victims, generations of victims molded by an ideology they never chose." In the months that followed, journalists, sociologists, and geneticists descended upon Pike County, seeking to piece together how such a nightmare could persist undetected into the modern era. Television crews filmed the hollow's ruins, splintered cabins, rusted farm tools, children's toys fashioned from bone and wire, a haunting visual of decay. Public reaction swung between horror and pity. The Blackburns became a grim national fascination, their story cited in documentaries, academic studies, and even urban legends. But behind every sensational headline lay the quiet truth, a family erased by the delusion of one woman who believed she could perfect her bloodline. As historian Dr. Eleanor Watts later wrote, "The Blackburns remind us that isolation can birth civilizations of madness. What began as one woman's dream of purity ended in a slow-motion collapse, generations dissolving into silence, their cries lost in the mountains. Today, the remnants of the Blackburn Hollow lie silent beneath a canopy of overgrowth. Nature has reclaimed nearly everything. The cabins have collapsed into piles of rotted timber, the wells are filled with debris, and the narrow footpaths that once connected the shacks have vanished beneath moss and roots. Few venture there now. Those who do speak of an unnatural stillness, no birdsong, no rustle of movement, just a kind of oppressive quiet that seems to linger long after you've left. To locals, it remains a cursed place, a wound in the heart of the Appalachian wilderness that never fully healed. In the decades since the 1974 discovery, the Blackburn case has become a reference point in both genetic and sociological studies, a textbook example of multigenerational isolation and the catastrophic consequences of inbreeding. Yet beyond the medical data, it remains a haunting testament to something deeper, the fragility of human morality when isolation becomes ideology. Eleanor Blackburn's writings are now housed in a restricted archive at the University of Kentucky. Scholars occasionally request access, though few make it past the first pages. The tone shifts over time, from rational observation to frenzied devotion, until her words dissolve entirely into religious mania and self-worship. In one of her final entries, dated 1969, she wrote, "The blood is the truth. The world outside is decay. When my line is complete, we will rise clean, untouched by the rot of man." But there was no rising, only collapse. By the time of her death, her descendants had become the physical embodiment of the very corruption she claimed to escape. Dr. Sarah Williams, reflecting decades later, summarized it best. Eleanor wanted immortality through her bloodline, but what she created was extinction. Her descendants didn't vanish by chance, they dissolved under the weight of her delusion. Today, the story of the Blackburns endures less as a piece of folklore and more as a cautionary echo, a reminder of how easily human conviction can twist into catastrophe when it's left unchallenged and unobserved. As the fog settles over those hills each night, some locals still claim they see faint lantern light flickering through the trees, as though the Blackburns never truly left, forever wandering the land that bore their madness. Maybe it's just superstition. Or maybe, as the old-timers whisper, some bloodlines refuse to die, they just fade into the earth that made them.